So just a few Bible readings, because we're covering quite a lot today. The print has got smaller, as you'll see. Proverbs chapter 10. Proverbs chapter 10. Just verse 1 to verse 6. And I'm trying to just sum up these books. Maybe it's not the only way you could sum them up, but I'm trying to sum up the books with two words: optimistic or pessimistic. Optimistic, my glass is half full. The pessimist, my glass is half empty. Look at these words. Are these optimistic or pessimistic? So, Proverbs 10. The Proverbs of Solomon. A wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is the grief of his mother. Treasures of wickedness profit nothing, but righteousness delivers from death. The Lord will not allow the righteous soul to famish, but he casts away the desire of the wicked. He who has a slack hand becomes poor, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. He who gathers in summer is a wise son. He who sleeps in harvest is a son who causes shame. Blessings are on the head of the righteous, but violence covers the mouth of the wicked. And then turn over, just on over to the book of Ecclesiastes. The book of Ecclesiastes, and read from verse 1 of chapter 9. So chapter 9. For I considered all this in my heart, so that I could declare it all, that the righteous and the wise and their works are in the hand of God. People know neither love nor hatred by anything they see before them. All things come alike to all. One event happens to the righteous and the wicked, to the good, the clean, and the unclean, to him who sacrifices and him who does not sacrifice. As is the good, so is the sinner. He who takes an oath is he who fears an oath. This is an evil in all that is done under the sun, that one thing happens to all. Truly the hearts of the sons of men are full of evil. Madness is in their hearts while they live, and after that they go to the dead. But for him who is joined to all the living there is hope. For a living dog is better than a dead lion. But the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing. And they have no more reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. Also their love, their hatred, and their envy have now perished. Never more will they have a share in anything done under the sun. Go eat your bread with joy, and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already accepted your works. Let your garments always be white, and let your head lack no oil. Live joyfully with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life, which he has given you under the sun all your days of vanity. For that is your portion in life, and in the labor which you perform under the sun. Amen. Could you imagine that one at a wedding? That verse been read out. You're married now, just go and live out all the days of your vain life. Empty, futile, full of hope, optimistic. No, it doesn't seem so. It seems as if it's pessimistic. And what I want to get across right at the start today is that I don't think we're ever meant to fully get our heads around the wisdom books. I don't think by the way they're written that we are fully meant to say, I understand every phrase completely, and I understand what it's doing and where it's going, and I understand everything about it. Why I'm saying that is there's a sense in which you've just got to swim about in these books. Swim about in them. never let the phrases go out of your head, that some of them pull you towards sheer optimism, that there is an order in the universe, but others pull you towards chaos in the universe. And you'll see that in Graham Goldsworthy's book, that trilogy book. In his book, Gospel and Wisdom, I mentioned Gospel and Kingdom, but in that trilogy there's Gospel and Wisdom. And he talks about the hiddenness of order in some of the books. And then he talks about the order in other books. And that's why we just simply need to see these are interesting books. They're interesting books because, I don't know, perhaps, and I'm only speculating, but others would speculate this as well, these books were meant to be read amongst the nations. And why I would say that, if you even look at the end of Proverbs, King Agur, who is he? Other kings, other nations perhaps were meant to interact, because these other nations had lots of little things like this, proverbs. They had lots of little sayings. They had their own wisdom books. So perhaps the very fact that Israel's history isn't really mentioned, hinted at, yes, but not overly explicit in these books, that's perhaps a big factor to take into account. Just look at Proverbs. When we read those books or those verses in Proverbs, did it not just tell you, if you do a certain thing, God will do a certain thing? If you live in a certain way, God will do this for you. Isn't that what it says? And the Proverbs are filled with verses like that. If you do this, then God will do this. He will reward the righteous, but he will bring down the foolish and the wicked people. And the very fact there are proverbs, I give this illustration often, but when I was really young, so that's a long, long time ago, I went down to the shop with 5p, okay? And you could get shoes that were a quarter of a penny back then, 1970 something. They were called blackjacks. And you could get 4 for a penny. So I just spent all my 5p on all these blackjacks and just brought them back up home. And my mum didn't give me a 10-minute talk on how I should manage my money. She just said these words: a fool and their money are soon parted. Those words stuck, because there's a lot contained in just a few words. And that's why the Proverbs were good. Have any of you tried to memorize the Proverbs? I'm telling you, try to. And you may get mixed up on some of the other things I say, but here's a good thing to do on a practical level. Try to memorize the book of Proverbs. Some of these chapters, like chapter 10. Some of the chapters that speak about being tempted to sin. And when you memorize Proverbs, it's a really interesting thing, because when you're tempted to sin, these little statements come back to you, and the Proverbs spell out the emptiness, the silliness of giving in to sin. The Proverbs spell it out, and that's what I want to get across to you. Just think of the practical use for any Jew using the book of Proverbs. Yes, they had the temple. Yes, they had the sacrificial system. But on daily life, they were tempted to do things that they shouldn't do. They were tempted to be evil. They were tempted to be greedy, to be envious. Just think of envy alone. How does envy alone affect your life? Everyone here in this room is affected to some degree by envy, and you get the Proverbs that speak against that. You get those verses and you memorize them, and when you're feeling envious, you think about this, and you just say, how empty it is, how silly that God, who has given me what he's chosen to give me and seen fit to give me, that I should live under the power and the dominion of something like envy. So do you see, on a practical level, the Proverbs are full of optimism. You live for God, He will reward you. There is order in the universe. There is order. And the Jewish people were meant to think about that. So that's Proverbs summed up. We're doing no more. Move on to Song of Solomon. How many sermons have you heard in your life on the Song of Solomon? It would be interesting, because there is language in the Song of Solomon that Jewish people thought was so plain and even explicit that some thought it must be an allegory. Now, you know what I mean by an allegory, like Animal Farm. Who's read Animal Farm? Okay, well, you know the way the animals take over the farm. Did that happen in history? Don't think so. No, I'm sure it didn't happen. The animals didn't take over the farm, because it's all a story where these characters are meant to represent political things. It's meant to get across a message. So it's not the focus on this really happened. And this story about love between two people in the Song of Solomon is something that Jewish people and a lot of Christian people down through the centuries have said, well, you couldn't really go around reading in church that sort of language. So maybe it's just all about God and us, and it's nothing really to do. It's nothing to do with those lovers that are spoken about in the book. It's not really speaking about human level. It's just fictional, and it is a fictional poem, but it's just speaking about something else. But in more recent years, people have revisited that idea and said, well, no, it really is a celebration. It really is an acknowledgement of the power of love. That's not a song title, okay? It's just the power. And I want to say, I spoke about envy a moment or two ago. That's one of the strongest feelings you'll ever feel. But love probably is the strongest feeling you'll feel. Everyone here will be confronted by that. Loving things, loving people, that power. And in the Song of Solomon, this is celebrated. It is marvelous the way God has made us. It is marvelous that when you read through the Song of Solomon, it's about the ups and downs of two people who are in love. And through sometimes their own negligence, or perhaps others who want to separate them. And there are different interpretations how to interpret, are there two or three people in the story. We haven't time to go into all of those details, but it's really saying, in the middle of all that pressure, the power that these people feel for one another is marvelous. And when you do read through it and you think, this is amazing, how God has made humans to enjoy this. We're not just atoms and molecules. We're not just beings trying to pass on our DNA. You see, that's the celebration. That's shoving it back in the face of science that tell us that our primary reason for you guys seeking out a partner in life is you want to pass on your DNA because it's something to do with evolution. That's what the world tells you ultimately are. But this book tells you, no, you're made in God's image. You're made to love. It is something just incredible. And I want to say that, try to get your head around that. Maybe don't even read the book yourself. Read it with other people. Get a little commentary on it. And think about that. And if you want further information on that, you can contact me, email me, or whatever, and I'll send you what we did in Riverside, just one sermon on the possible ways to interpret the book. So if you want more information on that, we simply don't have time. Because what I'm trying to say about this book is, in the celebration of love, is that it is optimistic. It's joy. It's full of joy. It's full of celebration. It's something marvelous that humans can give thanks for. They've been made in God's image. And also, in the book, you've got to see that I don't agree with the allegory, but there's something about the way God has made us to love things and to love other people. There's something that has to correspond, and I've chosen that word very deliberately, correspond. Something like a pattern, but I'm choosing the word deliberately, that corresponds to God's love for his people. There is an intensity in God's love for his people. There is something far more intense than we will ever get our minds around. And I think the book ultimately points us in that direction. So it's optimistic, it's a celebration, and it points us to God's love. But then you read on, and you come to Ecclesiastes. What's it all about? What is Ecclesiastes about? And I have to say, it's one of my favorite books in the whole Bible. Just the way it leaves you totally mixed up. It pulls you this way and it pulls you that way. You're like an elastic band, you're stretched. What is it saying? And I think it's so hard to interpret because sometimes you don't even know whether or not the positive phrases are even being said sarcastically. You don't know what's going on. It's so difficult to get your mind around. And if you listen to people interpreting the book of Ecclesiastes, there are all sorts of different interpretations. And that's why we don't have time to go into all of this, but I just want to get this across. Those first two books, full of optimism and order, but Ecclesiastes challenges the order. There's something about the order in the universe that isn't quite right. And so when I deliberately chose Proverbs 10 and then Ecclesiastes 9, because they contradict one another at face value. Because Ecclesiastes 9 says, no, it just happens to them all. The righteous, the unrighteous, the clean, the unclean. Doesn't matter if you offer sacrifices, don't offer sacrifices. It'll just happen all the same. Whereas Proverbs says, no, if you live for God, there will be some distinction in the way you live and the way people who don't live for God. There'll be a huge difference in the end. But Ecclesiastes challenges that. And you've got to read that because even the positive bits where it speaks about enjoying your food and enjoying the world, but mixed in with it sometimes are these phrases, just go away and enjoy your vain life. Isn't that really strong? I don't want you to leave here today and think that's the way you have to go away, because it's not like that. It's meant to get you thinking. It's meant to get you thinking, my father and mother brought me up, a Jew would have said, to believe that if I honor God, I will be blessed. And as this person grows up in their life and they honor God, it's a bit like Psalm 44. It's nothing but misery and chaos, losing their health, losing their wealth, losing their friends. Their whole life falls apart. And they say, and I have honored God. That's what Ecclesiastes wrestles with. Does it come to a conclusion? Well, you could write 10 books on that. Does it come to a conclusion? Is it at the start, as Tremper Longman says, is someone looking at the preacher and then concluding what the preacher says at the end, and in between it's the preacher's words? It might be. And I would possibly just tend towards the fact that it doesn't leave you completely without despair. Because in case people are overwhelmed, I think the last two verses may point you to something more solid. The last two verses in the book of Ecclesiastes help me to think that there are creatures at the bottom of the sea that no eye will ever see. No person will ever experience them. We will never know really what they are like. What's their purpose in this whole universe? And the last two verses tell us, well, it's ultimately God's verdict of what their purpose is. So there may be hope, but even if there's not hope in those last two verses, what's the book doing? It's saying, how can you not see that it's not all optimistic? It's not all celebration. My life falls apart and awful things happen. And that leads us into the book of Job, fourth wisdom book in 18 minutes so far. Okay, right. So the fourth wisdom book is Job, an amazing book. Job loses his wealth, his family, his health as a result of a conversation between Satan and God. Isn't that incredible? He loses all these things in his life because of a conversation between Satan and God. But he doesn't know about that conversation. Only the reader of the story knows about the conversation. And when Job suffers, and then he loses his family and he loses his health, and his three friends come, they do something like the people in Isaiah 52 and 53 were saying. They see a man suffering and they say, this can only mean one thing. This can only mean one thing. He must have done something in his past. And it's his own pride, he's not confessing it. And it's getting worse and worse and worse. And here is this man declaring he's innocent, but he is not. And what does Job do? He disagrees with them. He disagrees strongly with them. And he argues with them. And that's why the book's so long. Because the arguments back and forth between the three friends and Job, they are huge. But I want to draw out one verse that we'll return to later, and it's Job 19. And Job says about his words that he wishes they were written down on a rock with an iron pen and lead forever. And then he says in Job 19, verse 25, a well-known word, and I'm going to use different translations here, for I know that my vindicator lives. We translated Redeemer, and sometimes we add other things into that, but it is the kinsman Redeemer. It's that idea. But translated as vindicator, or this idea of a person who will stand up and speak on your behalf one day. And what we don't see is the context of this, I know my vindicator or my Redeemer lives, is that he says, the vindicator's going to stand up for me one day, and he see you three friends, you better watch out, because he's going to speak on my behalf, and he's going to declare that I haven't done the things you are accusing me of, and you will be judged. And so the context of, I know my Redeemer lives, I know my vindicator lives, is that argument. You've told me I'm sinning, but I am telling you no. And here, my Redeemer, my vindicator will live. And it's really interesting how you approach that verse in the book of Job. We're going to come back to that right at the end. But there's a fourth friend in the book of Job. He's my favorite character in these wisdom books, because he's called Elihu, and I argue strongly that Elihu speaks the truth. A lot of people call him the angry young man, and they say he just speaks more mistruth. That's how hard it is to interpret this. But if you ever want a really good book on this, it's a book written in the 1800s by William Henry Green, and it's called The Argument of the Book of Job. The Argument of the Book of Job. It's not a commentary, but he just writes about the overview of the argument. And he argues so strongly that Elihu speaks the truth. And why does Elihu speak the truth? Because he's the first speaker that breaks the link between X amount of sin means X amount of punishment, or so much sin means so much punishment. And Elihu breaks that link. And do you know something? I did the closing lecture in the college when I was a moderator on the last two verses that Elihu says. They are amazing. You just learn these verses, and when you're struggling in your own life, you just think about this verse, especially the penultimate verse. It says, "As for the Almighty, we cannot find him. He is excellent in power. In judgment and abundant justice, he does not oppress." It sums up what God's going to say. You can't find me out, because that's then what God says. And he speaks to Job. And he says, why are you asking me questions? Why do you want your day in court with me? Why do you even call my justice into question? Just look at chapter 9, verse 22 to see how far Job goes. Because when he thinks of nothing but his innocence, he ends up calling God's justice into question. It's a very, very devastating verse. Chapter 9, verse 22. And so Job wants his day in court. So God gives him his day in court. And he says, well, wrestle with me now. Literally, wrestle with me. He says, were you there when I created the world? And one great phrase, and I look at this every single night that there are stars and you see the belt of Orion, he asks Job, can you loose the belt of Orion? And isn't it a great picture language? How feeble you are, Job. You can't do anything to the stars that I have spoken into being. So why are you trying to contend with me in court? And God never explains what we know when we read through the book of Job. But Job realizes, yes, I do not even have the understanding to know how God works. And there may be chaos in my life. There may be a complete darkness and falling apart of everything that I have. But he sees that he will still trust the God who can loose the belt of Orion, who has spoken the creation into being. Marvelous book, the book of Job, but it really does, it's one of those books you probably need to read in a group, okay? Sometimes when you read it on your own, yes, it's good as you get older and older, you can read it on your own, but sometimes it's really encouraging. And think about that, reading the Bible with other people, reading the Bible, because sometimes we just get away on our own and say, that's the only way to read the Bible. Sometimes we just need to minister to one another just by little things, thoughts that we have, helping one another through the Bible. So we come to the final point, and I've entitled it Resurrection. And as you come to two very optimistic books, Song of Solomon and Proverbs, you come to Ecclesiastes and you come to Job, which aren't full of optimism, but they are shocking at times. And you think of what is going on. What I'm telling you here today is that you won't find Jesus clearly in every line in the book of Job. or in Ecclesiastes word for word. But the books are getting you ready. They are getting Israel ready. They are getting the Jews ready for one who can answer the optimism and the pessimism of those books. You see, let's revisit the books just very briefly in light of the resurrection. How can I be sure that it's worthwhile for me to not punch somebody in the face when they do me harm? What's going to tell me that? Well, the Bible tells me that. Don't show evil for evil. If they do you harm, don't return evil. Now, that doesn't seem like this in this life. Proverbs doesn't seem to come true. But in light of the resurrection of Jesus, every single thing will be judged by him. And so by not returning evil for evil, right now in this scene of time, who's going to take that into account ultimately? It is Jesus who is risen from the dead, who will judge the whole world. Do you see what I mean by that? You see, Proverbs tells you to be optimistic, but you keep seeing something else. And so the optimism of Proverbs can only be seen in light of Jesus, who will not let one thing escape his notice. Every single thing. This is the God who knows sparrows that fall, who knows the hairs on our head. And this is the God who will consider everything. And so can we see that it's still worthwhile to follow the optimism of Proverbs? Yes, because Jesus has risen. That makes all the difference. What about the Song of Solomon? Well, the Song of Solomon speaks of human love, as we've said, and it's intense. And I think as Christians, you especially need to get to grips with that. You need to talk about it, and you need to see how loving someone changes your life. Loving people brings down governments at times. Loving people splits up families if it's not the right person. All sorts of things happen because people do not realize how powerful this is. So it's intense. But it's always to be seen, if you're a Christian, as a gift from God. And when you literally feel the intensity of that love, and then you think, and how much does God love me? How intensely does he love me? There has to be also that aspect. And that's why it's not surprising that Paul in Ephesians 5 speaks of Christ giving himself for the church, for us, because he loves us. That's so important. And in fact, it is that love that Jesus shows for the church that is then to be reflected upon the love you have for other people. Now, I don't know the best way to put this, but, Foreign Presbyterian camps are good, senior camps are good, because sometimes you can end up meeting someone and you might marry them and it'll all work out happily ever after and all of that. So it's good for that. And it's thinking about be fruitful and multiply. It's working that out. I understand all that. But please just realize this. It is a very powerful thing. And when you want to think about loving another person, model your love for that other person on how Jesus Christ loves the church. Model your love for them, what brings them good, what does good to them. That's really important. But never forget, it's joy. It's fullness of joy in so many ways. And we're not, and get this message out to the world. The Song of Solomon confronts the whole evolutionary speak. It confronts it and it says, no, this is joy. This is more than trying to be successful on an evolutionary scale. Well then, thirdly, we come to the book of Job. And does Job 19, when it mentions the vindicator or redeemer, is it speaking about Jesus? Some people argue very strongly, yes. Some people say, no, it's not that plain. And the way I would leave it is, I would probably sit on the fence a bit there, and I would say, yeah, it's not easy figuring out what's going on in Job 19, but what does it do? It gets you ready for this person who will sort everything out in the end. It gets you ready for a person who will make sure every single injustice, every single wrong is exposed. And that person ultimately is Jesus. And so, in a sense, you may not see it directly, a direct prophecy of Jesus. You may not say, open your Bible and say, now it's speaking of Jesus. You see, in a sense, it's getting us ready in the whole book for Jesus. It's showing us what needs to be fixed, what needs to be sorted out. And it really will be sorted out someday. And I want to give one example. I hope it's not okay giving this example, but I have actually talked to people who have been cheated by other people in life out of lots and lots of money. And they just confided in me. These people are dead now, but I'm saying to you, they struggled. And they asked me, when I visited them, they said, but what do I do? How can I get justice? And I always used to point them to Job 19. I always used to take them there and say, but it will be worked out one day, every single detail. That doesn't sometimes help them. You've got to realize that. But what other direction can you point them in? There is no other direction to point them in than just simply to say, it really will be dealt with. That injustice will be exposed one day when Jesus Christ returns. And so the book of Job gets us ready to deal with, yes, chaos in our lives, but especially the injustice of being wrongly accused. And that really becomes a central theme in the book. But then finally, we've kept Ecclesiastes to the last for a big reason. Because in Romans 8, it is very probable that Paul is thinking about the book of Ecclesiastes. In Romans 8, he speaks from verse 18 on, and maybe it would be the best thing if you want to do the discussion time to start in Romans 8 and work your way back. Because he just says things like this it says, for the creation in verse 20 was subjected to futility or vanity. It's the same word as in Ecclesiastes. Not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope. Because the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pangs together until now. What is Paul saying about the futility and the vanity that Ecclesiastes confronts you with? He's saying there's only one answer to that. There's only one answer. There is no other answer except new creation. That is the only answer to all futility, all vanity, all emptiness. I remember walking to lectures with a fellow when I was in university, and he was in the accounting class, and it was coming up to the finals time, and I was walking along with him and we talked. He was a Christian fella, and we were walking into lectures talking about things, and then it was time off for revision, and the next thing is I saw the Belfast Telegraph one day, and his picture was on the front of it, and he'd fallen off the Cave Hill and died. And you just say to yourself, there was a Christian guy, his life was full of promise, he was just finishing his degree. It just seems so empty, doesn't it? And you see, it's because our suffering often is so empty that it penetrates so deeply. You ask, why do things happen? Even as simple as this, and I'm just sharing my thoughts here, so I hope you can bear with me on this. But I remember when we lived in Ballylagan, going out to our shed one day and finding a whole nest of wrens, and they were all dead. And I realized that the mother had probably been killed by a cat. And as I looked at them, it really stirred the emotion up. Because you're saying, in the whole history of space and time, why create their little beaks? Why create their little brains? And they die in a nest of starvation. There are things like that, and I've seen other things. I better not share all the stories that I think about like this, or depress you all. But I want to get that across. You see, there is no answer to that except new creation. And where does the new creation begin? It begins on that first day of the week when Jesus Christ is raised from the dead. And I know Paul uses a different word at the end of 1 Corinthians 15, verse 58, but it is a word for emptiness. It's not exactly the same word that's used in Romans 8. But in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 58, and this is where we leave it. After discussing theology for many, many verses, after discussing the resurrection of Jesus and why it's necessary, after going into detail upon detail about the resurrection of Christ, what does Paul say in the closing verse in chapter 15? We'll read this and get the first word, therefore. Therefore, what does that mean? In light of the resurrection. Therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. And so when you encourage someone and nobody else sees it, when you phone someone and nobody else sees the Christian encouragement you give them, when you stand with someone who just needs someone to be with them, when you do all of that and that it's hidden, is it vain? No, it's not. When it's done for God's kingdom, it is given meaning. And why? It's given meaning because Christ has been raised from the grave. So look at those wisdom books, see their optimism and see their pessimism. But both their optimism and their pessimism must be seen in light of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Amen. Let's just close in prayer. Our Father, we thank you that you give us the wisdom books to make us think. We know that at times we might be mixed up in our own lives and we wonder why you let things happen. We can't get our minds around some of our own experiences. But we earnestly pray that we would keep looking towards the new creation, to know that when we're just adrift, when we're just swallowed up by the seeming emptiness of suffering, that we would see the certainty of the new creation. Encourage us to do this in Jesus' name. Amen.